kinesiology, motor movement, the sports sciences, and then people sort of like swung that over into being a sports psychologist. Then we also have people who have terminal degrees in psychology that maybe don't necessarily have a lot of sports science, and sometimes those people are as, let's say, ill-equipped, maybe as the people who might be a PhD in PE or something like that. I mean, best of all worlds is to have a background in sports science and psychology, and the states require, by state law, that if you're going to call yourself a sports psychologist, that you must be licensed in that state to do that. So it's legal terminology that we're dealing with here, as well. There's also some ethical issues in terms of, like the menu that we'll get into in a minute, Dave. It really differentiates between the psychological issues that we deal with in performance versus the performance issues that we deal with in performance. And it's really important that if you're dealing with either one of those areas or both of those areas, that you have the academia and the experience, and in some cases the licensure to be able to provide those services. And so I think we who are in this business really, it's necessary for us to educate, the coaches, the teams, the players, the public, in terms of what this really means to kind of clear this thing up, because it's been kind of in the fog for way too long.
Yeah, and as someone whose first love of sports was baseball, that's probably the classic one, because it is a sport that you have way too much time on your hands to think, and then you have a split second to do what you have to do. And I think that the worst stereotype that I've seen of it was in the movie The Natural. Where
Robert Redford. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it was like a carnival setting practically, that they were, trying to take a losing team into just thinking differently. And I remember, going back, 20 years ago, I think it was the Minnesota Twins, Chuck Knobloch, second baseman, somehow could not throw the ball to second base.
Yeah.
And then you'll hear about those things. But what more recently, what I remember was, and again, I'm going to keep celebrating for another 107 years, my Cubs, from a year and a half ago.
Good on you. Good on
you,
Dave.
So they won, but both of those teams, both the Cleveland Indians and the Chicago Cubs, part of their success, and again, not getting out of the basement, part of their success was they each had good sports psychologists that were around during the good times, if you will.
Yeah.
It wasn't, they brought him in to get him back on track and then said, okay, thank you very much, we'll let you know if we start tanking games again. I mean, they were there to keep them up top. It wasn't to pull them out of the bottom. And I think that's where finally you start to not see the sports psychologist as a stigma. That's what you need when you're stuck in your head and you're jinxed otherwise.
Yeah. And for an example, you mentioned Cleveland. I mean, Charlie Meyer has been at Cleveland. He's been there for 30 years.
Really?
So he's been there through the good and the bad, mostly the bad with Cleveland. Right. But more recently the good. So if we think about investing in a sports psychologist, it really needs to be a long-term investment, because we're talking about development of coaches, development of scouts, development of the organization. Because bringing a sports psychologist in for a year or two or three or something like that, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, and I can believe that. But just like when you'll see in any sport, whether it's a team coach or a personal, coach on individual things, it's those long-term relationships or people that have shown that they can take on multiple athletes, they can just connect that easily. It's that ability to connect, and it's not, like I say, you don't just order up those services. Maybe a personal trainer, but not for really trying to make sure you are seeing things in the right way. And let's get into that now, because you talk about this menu that you've got it broken into appetizers, entrees, and the desserts here. So let's talk about the appetizers and why you pick these and what they're all about.
Yeah. Well, and again, a little bit of history about this menu. It developed out of some frustration that I was having, Dave, and that was that when somebody, okay, what do you do? What do you do? That's what people do, I guess, when they get together for the very first time. And talk about being a sports psychologist, and they kind of go, well, that's really interesting. So what do you do? And it like stopped me in my tracks, in terms of, okay, now how can I, in the briefest, simplest way possible, explain what I do? Because it's pretty broad in terms of what I do. And I'd had somebody ask me that question during the day, and then later that night, my wife and I had gone out to eat, and I was sitting there, kind of perusing the menu, and all of a sudden it dawned on me, that's what I needed to do for my restaurant, I guess my Sports Psychology Inn, and that was to come up with a menu of topics that I would serve, much like the restaurant had their menu, that they would serve. And that way there's no doubt about what you're getting. And so that's where this menu idea, really came from a long time ago. And just like the menu, it's broken into appetizers and entrees and desserts like you talked about. And it really divided up the services that I provide kind of into those three categories as well. Appetizers, which are the best things you can get when you go to a restaurant, as far as I'm concerned. It's the good stuff because you don't get a full meal. And the things I have listed under the appetizer section is the sport part of the sports psychology services that I provide. So those are all performance-oriented kinds of topical areas, which we can get into more specifically. But for an example, we'll have maybe some of the sports science people that might be involved in providing some of these kinds of services, where you don't have to have a psychology degree, basically to provide sport performance kinds of services. But you do need to know something about sports science. You need to know something about the sport. So you'd mentioned baseball. It's really helpful if you're a sports psychologist and know something about baseball, about the language of baseball, the rules of baseball. So when I pick up a new sport, first thing I do is read the rules book. Because usually I'm only one of two people that might read the rules book in an entire organization. It's so strange. People still don't read the rules book. But I read that just to kind of dial into, okay, what's the sport about, right now? And so the appetizer section is really more about sport and sport performance, getting this person to be a better athlete. The entrees section.
Well, actually, hold on, just because I know people can't see us, but let's do two things before we move on.
Sure.
One, let's give out your website and other information so that if people want to really get into this, because everyone, there's about 20 items on each of these here, and I'm going to rattle off a few real quickly just to give you a flavor. But tell people how they can get a hold of you, so if they really want to get into this, they can get a hold of you.
I think the best way for people to get a hold of me would be, again, the more old-fashioned way. I've had a website that's been up and down and up and down. I've tore it down and built it back up again. But what I've realized that if people want to get a hold of me and actually get this information, they can email me or text me. That's the best way, because I can get a lot more specific information if I could actually talk to that individual personally. So my email is dr, like doctor, and then Jim Bauman, Bauman, @gmail.com.
So Dr. Jim Bauman at Gmail. Excellent.
And then a phone number. I mean, I get calls, I'll take texts, and my phone number is 434-987-2918.
Yeah, and I can attest to his accessibility that when Dr. Estenal said, hey, you and Jim should connect, we quickly texted back and forth and started emailing, and it's so refreshing to have somebody just on the other end of the line all the time. But before we go on to entrees, here are some things that I just circled that caught my eye. Were appetizers: transforming into the champion mindset, teammates versus team play, fuel tanks, and I'm going to ask you about this last one because I see it used so many times. I wonder what if it's almost losing its meaning, but grit, that and resilience. I'll just say the two of those are probably two of the biggest bumper stickers right now about you need to develop grit and be resilient. But it's not always like the how part I think we'd all agree when we think of those words, that we want to, be tenacious and never stop and keep moving forward. But real quickly, how do you deal with grit, you personally? Again, this is the sports side of it. And let's pick, you said you're working with a team of soccer players right now?
Right.
So let's go with that, since that's what you're in the zone on right now. What are some of the, again, typical things that you find are important with helping instill that?
Well, it depends on the age of the athlete you're working with. Mm-hmm. It depends on the level that they're competing at, and I think those are two really, really key pieces. So the work I do with like high school kids is different than the work I do with college versus an Olympic athlete versus a professional athlete, just in terms of where they are in terms of their chronological development.
Can you give us a brief example just to contrast a little bit? Because I think that's, again, where people hear a story and they may see it at the collegiate level, at the upper echelon, and try and take it to their JV team in high school or to their middle school team. And I think that's where things get off the tracks. Exactly.
So, imagine for a moment, maybe some adolescent kids who are in high school. So we're talking people who are 15 to 18 years old. And then we jump up to the next level of people, let's say in college, that are, let's say, 18 to 22. And then we get into the professional level. And of course, it used to be just 22 and above, and now we got some 18, 19-year-olds that are there as well. And so developmentally, the people that are older, some of these things will make more sense to them simply because they got a little more life experience that they can draw from. And I can draw from their life experiences and what they've done to kind of make some sense out of some of these grit ideas, or resilience kind of ideas. But if I've got somebody who's in high school, for an example, they've got fewer life experiences to sort of draw from that you can use as examples. And so I do a lot of storytelling, but I try to use their life examples to make some sense out of the sport world. So if they've had trauma, tragedy, and stuff like that kind of in their life, and maybe they just lost a big game or something like that, if you've got somebody who's older and has had some life experience, with loss during their lifetime and stuff like that, you can make more sense out of that loss and begin to sort of take a look at the different gradations of loss for older people than you have for these younger people down here. So you really have to be able to talk to them at their level. And again, like in high school, for an example, Dave, some of the things that I might use again, for older people, it's going to be different. Here's an example. Most high school kids, and even college kids, cannot read a regular clock on the wall. It has to be a digital clock. Yep. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. It's totally amazing. And so I make some assumptions about people and what they know simply because I know that. Maybe that's what I was raised with. But just something as simple as like when, if I'm helping people deal with their energy levels before a competition. I usually have posters that I put up, kind of in the locker room to kind of help them kind of work through that, and time schedules in terms of where they are before the game starts. And I realized that some of the locker rooms that I was using had the old style clocks with the hands on it, and the people couldn't tell the time. I literally had to go buy digital clocks and put them on the wall, so we'd be speaking the same language.
Yeah, just can't assume too much.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And the kinds of other things that people have going on in their lives going to be different for high school kids versus college kids versus pro athletes versus Olympic athletes. And so those things all play into it as well.
Yeah, and
but if we go back to what you were talking about earlier in terms of grit, to kind of get back onto that, that's something we're talking about with this high school kid, the high school kids. And you'll also hear the word mental toughness a lot. Yeah. You got to be mentally tough. And what I learned in my work with the Navy SEAL teams was they are sort of the quote-unquote most mentally tough people I've ever met. But mentally tough did not did not